To use it in places they never imagined, in manners they never have before.
So when the first iPad mini first came out, I wasn't really sure why it came out, and to this day I'm still not really sure why it's still a thing, and to be honest I will probably never personally buy one. But in 2015, while I was in the 6th grade, our school district started using iPads for quote-unquote education purposes, and for the kids at elementary school, we got iPad mini 2s, and this was in 2015 when the iPad mini 2 was already nearly 2 to 3 years old at this point, which was kind of depressing. But for what we needed to do, it was completely fine. Really, all we did was just take notes and just play Clash of Clans and Minecraft. But enough of the backstory of this thing. Let's actually talk about if the iPad mini 2 is actually still worth it in 2020. So back in the early years of 2013, Apple released the iPad mini 2, which was really just a spec bump from the original iPad mini 1, with the specs being the Apple A7 processor, powered VR G6430 graphics, a single gigabyte of RAM, and 16 gigabytes of flash storage, and with the option of Wi-Fi or Wi-Fi and cellular data, which back in 2013, it was actually considered to be pretty decent, and 7 years later, it's fine, I suppose. But when compared to my 6th generation iPad and even my iPhone 11, yeah, this thing is slow. But there's still one thing about this iPad that still holds up to this day, and that would be the build quality. Even 7 years later, this iPad is still a very well built machine. If there is one thing that Apple almost always gets right, that would be the build quality of their devices. I mean, the iPad mini 2 is still a very sleek and modern machine with a sturdy aluminum and glass design that still holds up pretty well to this day, and I would guarantee if I put this next to the 5th gen iPad mini, someone probably couldn't even tell the difference, but that's mainly due to the fact that the design of the iPad mini really hasn't changed at all since the first one. I mean, it still uses the lightning charging port, has your standard power, volume up and down buttons, a physical home button which sadly has no touch ID, and even a headphone jack. Wait a minute. Now for the speakers on this iPad, well, the iPad mini 2 only has a pair of down-firing speakers, and which they definitely don't sound awful, but when compared to my iPhone and my 6th gen iPad, yeah, they don't hold up that well. Now for the display of the iPad mini 2, it's actually not horrible. It has an IPS 1536 by 2048 display with a PPI 326, which is pretty much the exact same display as the 5th gen iPad mini. Granted, it doesn't have True Tone display or the P3 wide color display, which is fine. Really? Even compared to my 6th generation iPad and even my iPhone 11, this display is still pretty good in 2020. Granted, it's not the best, but I mean, the viewing angles are still pretty good. It still gets fairly bright. And for a budget iPad that came out in 2013, this is still a really good display even for 2020. Next is the camera. And well, it's a camera. I mean, it still takes pictures and records video. Granted, it's not of the greatest quality, but I mean, it's not horrible. I mean, the main camera uses a 5 megapixel lens while the front facing camera uses a 1.2 megapixel lens. It still definitely can take some decent pictures and video, keep in mind, some. And for the microphone quality on this thing, it's certainly, well, not the best, but for an iPad that came out in 2013, what are you gonna expect? But what's it actually like to use this iPad? Well, after spending about a week with this thing, I gotta say, not the greatest. Unfortunately, this iPad is no longer supported by Apple, meaning it no longer gets any more updates directly from them, with the latest OS running on this thing being iOS 12.4.7. But even though it technically runs iOS 12.4.7, it definitely does not run well. But once you get past all the loading times, it can actually do almost anything that a modern iPad can actually do. Watching YouTube at 1080p works fine, Minecraft and other games run fine once you turn out the settings a bit, and for basic web browsing works perfectly fine, especially for watching hentai. FBI, open up! Now for battery life, this is where the iPad mini 2 shows its age. I only got about 2 to 3 hours of battery life from daily web browsing and just watching YouTube, which is kinda decent considering that this iPad is nearly 7 years old at this point. But considering the fact that the iPad mini 2 originally had a battery life of nearly 10 hours back in 2013 and it lost nearly 80% of that within 7 years, which is kinda concerning, but that's just mainly due to the fact that lithium just degrades over time, but your mileage may vary when buying one used. So yeah, the iPad mini 2 is a pretty outdated machine, and to be honest, it it's really not the greatest when it comes to daily tasks of just web browsing, YouTube watching, and just in general other things. But it still works, it just takes a while for it to load. And for how much these things cost on eBay as recording this video, which is May 2020, it's just not worth it. Really, the only way I can kind of recommend getting an iPad mini 2 in 2020 is if you can get it for less than $70. But really, even at that price, I wouldn't recommend getting one because I would just save your money and try to get either a used 5th or 6th gen iPad, or hell, even the first generation iPad Pro, because those are so much better. I mean, they're newer and faster, they have better specs, Apple officially supports them, some of them can even use the Apple Pencil, and just in general, just save your money, don't get the iPad mini 2. But if you can find one of these things cheap, and I mean like really, really cheap, like less than $40 cheap, go for it. But in my honest opinion, there's just really no point in buying an iPad mini 2 in 2020. I mean, granted, you can always jailbreak it, and I'm pretty sure there's many other ways you can get past it, but realistically, if you're going to spend less than $50 on an iPad, you most likely don't have the knowledge or the time to actually do that, so really, I don't really care anymore. You can do whatever the hell you want. I really don't care anymore.